On the evening Lady Eleanor Ashbourne turned 27. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments. The chandeliers of Ashbourne House burned with such brilliance that the marble floors reflected the guests like a second, wavering crowd beneath their feet. Light spilled over gilt mirrors, over garlands of winter roses, over silk gowns that whispered as their wearers leaned toward one another with polite curiosity disguised as admiration. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, champagne, and anticipation. Servants moved like quiet thoughts along the edges of the room. A quartet played near the balcony, their melody cheerful enough to suggest celebration, restrained enough to respect the dignity of rank. It was, in every visible way, a birthday befitting a duchess. At the top of the sweeping staircase, Eleanor paused before beginning her descent. From this height she could see the crown of every head, the glitter of tiaras, the pale oval faces lifted expectantly toward her. She knew precisely how she appeared, ivory silk clinging in modest lines to her frame, lace sleeves grazing delicate wrists, a single pearl resting at her throat. Her hair, arranged in soft coils, revealed the graceful length of her neck. She had practiced the expression she now wore in the mirror, composure warmed by faint pleasure, gratitude without vanity. Only her hands betrayed her. They trembled, barely perceptibly, against the polished banister. She had been waiting for her husband for nearly an hour. The Duke had not yet arrived. A murmur traveled through the ballroom like a draft under a closed door. No one spoke loudly enough to be accused of rudeness, yet every whisper carried. Guests exchanged glances that were at once sympathetic and intrigued. The absence of the Duke had already become the evening's quiet subject. Eleanor felt it as keenly as one feels a change in weather before the rain begins. She lowered her gaze and began to descend. Each step felt ceremonial. The music softened. Conversations hushed. She offered gracious nods to familiar faces, accepting curtsies and bows as though nothing in the arrangement of the evening were unusual. If her husband's absence wounded her, it would not be displayed for public inspection. She had been Duchess long enough to know that dignity, once dropped, was never fully retrieved. When her slippers touched the final step, the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Heads turned as if pulled by a single invisible thread. The Duke of Ashbourne entered the ballroom with unhurried confidence, his dark coat cut sharply against the glow of candlelight, his posture as impeccable as ever. A ripple of relieved laughter passed through the room. The evening, it seemed, could now proceed as intended. Then the second figure stepped through the doorway beside him. She was young, perhaps 20, perhaps less, with bright eyes and a smile too vivid for the subdued etiquette of the gathering. Her gown shimmered in deep sapphire silk, daringly fitted, adorned with jewels that caught the light greedily. Her hand rested comfortably upon the Duke's arm, not as a stranger seeking guidance, but as a woman accustomed to belonging there. The laughter died. Fans stilled mid-flutter. Conversations collapsed into stunned silence. The quartet faltered, then resumed with visible uncertainty. Eleanor did not move. From across the expanse of polished marble, she watched her husband escort the young woman into the center of the room as though presenting a guest of honor. Their steps were unhurried, deliberate. The Duke's expression remained calm, almost courteous, as if he had brought nothing more scandalous than an unexpected cousin. The realization came to Eleanor not as shock, but as confirmation. A quiet, dreadful confirmation of suspicions she had refused to name for months. This was Lydia Harrow. She had heard the name whispered by maids who thought themselves discreet. She had seen unfamiliar receipts tucked into coat pockets, smelled perfume that was not her own lingering faintly on linen. She had convinced herself that these were coincidences, misunderstandings, inventions of idle gossip. Now the truth walked openly across her birthday floor with a jeweled smile. The Duke approached her at last. "My dear Eleanor," he said, bowing over her hand with perfect formality, "forgive my lateness. Allow me to present Miss Harrow, who has expressed the warmest desire to wish you joy this evening." Miss Harrow dipped into an elegant curtsy, her eyes bright with something dangerously close to triumph. "Your Grace, it is an honor to celebrate with you." Eleanor studied the girl's face. She was beautiful in a way that required no effort, youthful, luminous, untested by disappointment. Eleanor felt, for one fleeting moment, an almost maternal sorrow for her. "How thoughtful," Eleanor replied, her voice steady as polished silver. "You are most welcome in my home." The Duke's eyes flickered briefly toward hers. He expected tears, or anger, or retreat. She offered him none. Around them, the guests struggled to reconcile etiquette with spectacle. Some turned away to preserve the illusion of privacy. Others watched with undisguised fascination. The scandal had already taken root. By morning it would be in every drawing room from here to London. Miss Harrow lifted a small velvet box from a tray carried by a servant. "A token," she said lightly, "from the Duke in honor of your birthday." She opened it to reveal a bracelet of diamonds so bright they seemed almost indecent in their extravagance. Eleanor did not look at the jewels. She looked at her husband. He had chosen to give his mistress the pleasure of presenting his gift. Something inside her settled into stillness. "Your Grace," she said gently, "how very generous of you both." She accepted the box without lowering her gaze. The room seemed to lean closer, waiting for the crack, the collapse, the moment of feminine distress they could pity and discuss. Instead, Eleanor smiled. It was not a brittle smile, nor a false one. It was calm, almost luminous, as if she had arrived at a conclusion that required no audience to understand. "How fortunate I am," she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "to be surrounded this evening by such memorable gestures." The Duke shifted slightly. Something in her tone unsettled him. Eleanor closed the velvet box with deliberate care and handed it back to the servant. "Please," she said, "see that this is placed with the other gifts." Her fingers then drifted, almost absent-mindedly, to her left hand, to the ring that had rested there for 7 years. And for the first time that evening, a murmur rose not from gossip, but from anticipation, as every eye in the ballroom followed the Duchess's slow, deliberate movement. A stillness, fragile as blown glass, settled over the ballroom as Eleanor's fingers rested upon the ring. Candlelight trembled in the crystals overhead, scattering fractured stars across the marble, yet no one dared to breathe loudly enough to disturb the moment forming at the Duchess's hand. The Duke watched her with an expression he had not worn in years: uncertainty. Beside him, Lydia Harrow maintained her bright composure, though her smile had thinned into something cautious, like a ribbon pulled too tight. Eleanor turned the band slowly, thoughtfully, as if reacquainting herself with an old companion. The gold had warmed to the shape of her life. 7 winters and springs had passed with that circle resting faithfully against her skin. 7 years of dinners, charities, long carriage rides, formal smiles, and private silences. 7 years of loving a man who had gradually learned to look through her rather than at her. She lifted her gaze first to Lydia. "Miss Harrow," she said, her voice gentle enough to be mistaken for kindness, "would you do me the favor of stepping a little closer?" A ripple passed through the guest. Lydia hesitated, then obeyed, the hem of her sapphire gown sighing across the marble as she approached. The Duke made a subtle movement as if to intervene, but something in Eleanor's calm prevented him. He had intended spectacle, but not this. Eleanor slid the ring from her finger. The motion was unhurried, almost reverent. The faint sound of gold against skin seemed louder than the quartet's distant melody. When the ring left her hand, a visible absence remained, pale against her skin like the memory of a vanished bruise. She extended her palm toward Lydia. "For you," Eleanor said. A collective breath swept through the hall. Lydia stared at the ring as though it were a living thing placed unexpectedly before her. The Duke's composure faltered. Color drained from his face in a way no gossip ever could have achieved. "Your Grace," he began. Eleanor did not look at him. "He is yours," she said softly to Lydia. The words did not echo, yet they seemed to strike every wall in the room. A lady near the balcony gasped audibly before covering her mouth. Fans fluttered again, not with flirtation but with shock. Several gentlemen exchanged glances that held something dangerously close to judgment. Lydia did not reach for the ring at once. Her eyes lifted to the Duke, searching for instruction, for reassurance, for ownership of the moment. He offered none. For the first time since entering the ballroom, he looked like a man who had miscalculated. Eleanor stepped forward and gently closed Lydia's fingers around the band. It was not an aggressive gesture, nor theatrical. It was tender, almost maternal, as though entrusting the girl with something fragile rather than discarding something broken. "You mustn't refuse," Eleanor murmured. "It has already served its purpose with me." The Duke found his voice. "Eleanor, this is unnecessary." She turned to him at last. "On the contrary," she replied with serene clarity, "it is the only necessary thing I have done this evening." A hush followed that felt heavier than outrage. The guests were no longer witnessing humiliation, they were witnessing authority. Not the authority granted by title, but the authority of a woman who had nothing left to protect except her dignity. Lydia's hand trembled as she held the ring. Its weight seemed to trouble her now. The triumph that had animated her entrance had drained away, replaced by an expression far younger than her painted confidence. She looked, suddenly, like a girl who had wandered into a room meant for grown hearts. Eleanor sensed it and felt, unexpectedly, no cruelty toward her. "Please," she said kindly, "enjoy the remainder of the celebration. It would pain me to think my birthday had inconvenienced anyone." The Duke stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You are making a spectacle of us." Eleanor met his gaze with composed sadness. "No, Your Grace. You did that when you chose your companion for the evening. I am merely concluding it." Around them the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Guests who had arrived prepared to admire a duchess now watched a woman reclaim herself in real time. The scandal, once centered on betrayal, had turned upon the betrayer. A few ladies lowered their eyes in respect. A few gentlemen bowed their heads almost imperceptibly toward Eleanor, as if acknowledging a victory that required no applause. The quartet continued to play, but the music sounded distant now, like a memory of celebration rather than its presence. Eleanor stepped back from Lydia and the Duke, creating a small but undeniable distance between them. She felt lighter, though nothing in the room had physically changed. The absence of the ring seemed to have removed a weight she had not known she carried. "I believe," she said evenly, "that I should allow my guests to enjoy themselves without further distraction." She offered a graceful nod to the nearest group of onlookers, who responded with awkward bows and curtsies, uncertain whether they had just witnessed a tragedy or a triumph. The Duke reached for her arm. "Eleanor, we must speak privately." "In time," she replied. "But not here. Not tonight." Her eyes drifted briefly to Lydia, who still stood motionless, the ring enclosed in her hand like a secret she no longer wished to possess. Eleanor turned away. She walked across the ballroom with unhurried elegance, aware that every gaze followed her retreat. The doors to the terrace stood open, admitting cool night air scented with roses and damp earth. Moonlight spilled across the threshold, silver and inviting. As she stepped beyond the reach of chandeliers and whispers, the music softened behind her, replaced by the quiet breathing of the garden. Gravel crunched faintly beneath her slippers. The sky above stretched wide and mercifully indifferent to human foolishness. For the first time that evening, Eleanor allowed herself to inhale deeply. Behind her, through the open doors, she could still see the ballroom's glow, and the faint outline of her husband standing rigidly beside the girl who now held his wedding ring. Moonlight received Eleanor like a confidant who asked no questions. The terrace stones held the day's warmth, yet the air had cooled into something clarifying, scented with damp roses and clipped hedges. From within the ballroom, music drifted outward in softened threads, as though the celebration had retreated into another life. She moved down the shallow steps into the garden without haste, her breath steady, her spine still bearing the quiet authority she had worn before the guests. Only when the doors fell partly closed behind her did she allow her shoulders to loosen by a fraction. Gravel whispered beneath her slippers. The hedgerows formed dark corridors that guided her toward the central fountain, where water folded over itself with patient rhythm. She paused there listening. The sound steadied her thoughts, which had begun to flutter now that the spectacle was done. Her left hand felt strangely bare, a cool absence where the ring had rested for years. She examined the pale circle on her skin, as if reading a history written in light. Footsteps approached from the terrace. She did not turn. She knew the cadence too well. "Eleanor," the Duke said behind her, his voice lowered by something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not pride. Something closer to disquiet. She watched the water spill from the fountain's lip. "Your guests will wonder at your absence. They are not my concern at present." "They have been for many months," she replied gently. "I should hate to interrupt the habit." He came to stand beside her. Moonlight found the sharp lines of his face and softened them, erasing the ballroom's authority. Without the audience, he looked less certain, as if stripped of a uniform he had worn too long. "You humiliated me," he said, but the accusation lacked force. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Did I? I believed I was relieving you of an obligation. This performance with the ring was the quietest act available to me," she said. "Anything louder would have been unseemly." He exhaled, a sound edged with frustration. "You might have spoken to me privately." "I have tried to speak to you privately for years," she answered. "You were seldom present long enough to hear." The words did not rise in volume, yet they seemed to land between them with undeniable weight. He looked at her then, properly looked, as if noticing the fine lines of weariness around her eyes, the composure that had cost her more than he understood. "You knew," he said. "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough to stop being surprised by it." He stared toward the dark hedges. "And you chose tonight to, what? Punish me?" She shook her head. No. Tonight was the first evening I realized I need not punish you at all. A silence followed that was not empty, but crowded with unspoken recollections. Early mornings riding across frost-bright fields. Evenings spent reading by the same fire. The slow erosion of those intimacies into parallel lives conducted under one roof. I never intended cruelty, he said at last. I believe you, she replied. Cruelty requires attention. You offered me neglect instead. He flinched as if struck. The fountain continued its patient conversation with the night. Somewhere beyond the hedges an owl called once, then fell quiet. She means nothing, he said abruptly. Eleanor's gaze did not waver from the water. That is precisely the difficulty. He frowned. I don't understand. If she meant something, Eleanor explained, I could at least compete with a feeling. But to be replaced by a diversion, by novelty, that is a different sort of vanishing. He searched her face, perhaps for tears, perhaps for anger. He found neither. What he saw unsettled him more, a woman who had already done her grieving. I did not think you unhappy, he admitted. You did not think of me at all, she said, not unkindly. The admission hovered between them, undeniable. He looked suddenly older, as if the night had added years to his expression. Why did you not confront me? Because I wished to preserve what little dignity remained to us both, she said. I hoped you would remember me without prompting. And tonight, he asked. Tonight you brought forgetting into my home and asked me to admire it. He covered his eyes briefly with his hand, then lowered it. What is it you want from me now? She considered the question with care. Nothing. The word unsettled him more than any demand could have done. That is impossible. It is already true, she replied. I find I have grown accustomed to wanting nothing. He stepped closer. Eleanor, we can mend this. She looked at him then, truly looked, and he felt the full weight of her calm regard. Can we mend something you never noticed was broken? He had no answer. The music from the ballroom swelled briefly, then faded again, like laughter remembered from another room. The night pressed gently around them, patient and impartial. I shall be leaving Ashbourne House in the morning, Eleanor said. The words fell with quiet finality. He stared at her. Leaving? For how long? I do not yet know. You cannot mean to abandon your home. I mean to rediscover myself somewhere beyond it. He shook his head. This is absurd. No, she said softly. This is overdue. A long pause followed. He seemed to search for authority to command her otherwise, but found none that would not expose his desperation. Eleanor, he said, and for the first time that night her name sounded like a plea rather than a formality, do not go. She felt the faintest tremor in her resolve, not of doubt, but of sorrow. You did not ask me to stay when it mattered. He reached toward her, then let his hand fall, uncertain whether he had the right to touch her. What am I to tell them? The guests? The household? The truth, perhaps, she said. It would be a novelty for us both. He almost smiled, but the expression faltered. And Lydia? Eleanor's gaze returned to the fountain. She will discover soon enough that a ring is heavier than it appears. Dawn entered Ashbourne House without ceremony, paling the chandeliers into dull glass and revealing the ballroom as a place of spent grandeur rather than spectacle. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps softened by carpets that had witnessed too much the night before. Eleanor stood in her dressing room while her maid folded garments into traveling trunks with careful efficiency. The room smelled faintly of lavender sachets and cooled candle wax. Outside, wheels were being readied upon gravel. She wore a simple morning gown of dove-gray wool, unadorned, practical, and strangely liberating. Her hair, uncoiled from its elaborate arrangement, rested in a modest knot at the nape of her neck. Without jewels or silk, she felt closer to herself than she had in years. The absence of the ring no longer startled her. It felt deliberate now, like a door she had chosen to close. A knock sounded at the door. Before her maid could answer, the Duke entered. He looked as though he had not slept. His coat was thrown hastily over yesterday's waistcoat, and his cravat sat imperfectly at his throat. The authority he usually carried like a second skin seemed to have been misplaced somewhere between midnight and morning. "Leave us," he said gently to the maid. She curtsied and withdrew, closing the door with a quiet click that echoed more loudly than any argument. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She finished fastening the clasp of her glove, attending to the small ritual with care. Only then did she face him. "The carriage will be ready shortly," she said. "You are truly going through with this," he replied, his voice rough with disbelief. "I informed you of my intention." I thought it an expression of emotion, not a plan. She regarded him calmly. You have often mistaken my resolve for sentiment. He stepped closer, glancing at the half-packed trunks. Where will you go? To the dower house near the western fields for now, she said. It is quiet there. I believe I require quiet. You cannot remove yourself from the estate over a misunderstanding. This is not a misunderstanding, she said. It is an understanding that arrived too late. He ran a hand through his hair, an uncharacteristic gesture of frustration. Lydia left before sunrise. Eleanor's expression did not change. I hope she travels safely. She was distressed, confused. She did not expect, last night? No one did, Eleanor replied softly. That was the point. He moved to the window looking out toward the pale lawns. The household is whispering. They do not know what to think. They are not alone, she said. He turned back to her. I will end it. Completely. You have my word. Eleanor tilted her head. And what precisely? This foolishness. This distraction. I will dismiss her from my life. She studied him for a long moment. You speak as though she were the cause of this. She is not. No, Eleanor said. She is the symptom. He fell silent. Outside, a stable hand called to another. The ordinary sounds of morning intruded gently upon the tension in the room, reminding them that life continued with indifferent persistence. I never wished to hurt you, he said at last. I know, she answered. You simply did not wish to see me. He absorbed the truth without argument. It seemed to cost him more than any accusation. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small and familiar. The wedding ring rested in his palm, dull in the gray light. She returned this before leaving, he said. Eleanor looked at it without reaching. It no longer belongs to me. It belongs to us. She shook her head faintly. There has been no us for some time. He crossed the room and held it toward her. Take it back. No. The refusal was gentle but absolute. His hand lowered slowly. Eleanor, I do not know how to repair what I have done. Repair requires acknowledgement of damage, she replied. You are only now surveying the ruins. He swallowed. Tell me what to do. The request hung between them with surprising humility. She considered him with quiet care. For the first time in many years, I do not wish to instruct you. A pause followed, charged not with anger but with recognition. He saw perhaps that she had spent too long guiding the emotional weight of their marriage alone. I cannot allow you to leave like this, he said, though the command lacked conviction. You cannot prevent me, she answered calmly. He looked at her as though seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. When did you become so distant from me? When I realized you had already gone, she said. A knock sounded faintly from downstairs, the signal that the carriage was ready. Eleanor picked up her gloves from the dressing table. The small, ordinary action seemed to carry enormous finality. She moved toward the door and he stepped aside without thinking, then caught himself. Will you return? He asked. I do not know, she said honestly. He watched her hand rest briefly on the doorknob. Eleanor. She turned. The desperation in his expression was no longer masked by pride. I love you. The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. She studied his face carefully, searching for the truth of it. You may, she said. But you have not known how to show it. Teach me, he whispered. A flicker of sorrow passed through her eyes. That is not a lesson I can give you any more. She opened the door. The corridor beyond felt cooler, wider, as though the house itself had drawn back to watch. Servants stood at respectful distances, pretending to be occupied while witnessing everything. Eleanor walked past them with quiet grace, neither hurried nor hesitant. The Duke followed several steps behind, no longer attempting to command the situation, only to remain near it. At the front entrance, the carriage waited beneath a sky still undecided between night and morning. The horses stamped lightly, their breath visible in the chill air. Eleanor descended the steps without assistance. He reached her just as she placed her foot upon the carriage step. Eleanor, please, he said not loudly but with a depth that carried. She paused and looked back at him. In that moment, with servants watching and dawn gathering strength around them, the Duke of Ashbourne appeared less like a master of estates and more like a man standing at the edge of losing the only thing he had never properly valued. She held his gaze for a long, searching second. Then she stepped into the carriage without giving him an answer.